Alright, in this video we are going to cover pages 217 to 219, numbers 1, 3 through 11, and 18 through 28. So this is the assignment for section 5.5, the first of two. So number 1, it says draw two parallel lines, okay, two parallel lines, and I indicate that these lines are in fact parallel by putting two little arrow symbols on them. There we go, two parallel lines. And a transversal. Remember, a transversal is a line that intersects at least two other lines. So there's my transversal. Label a pair of corresponding angles. A pair of corresponding angles. So you may have drawn the diagram this way, or potentially this way, or I mean, really, it could have been any different orientation here. But I'll just put it this way, and then it says label a pair of label a pair of corresponding angles. So I need two corresponding angles in here. All right, so to correspond, it would be this one and in the same relative position. So I'd be to the right and above, to the right of the transversal, above the parallel line. So you might have put to the right and below, to the right and below, to the left and above, to the left and above, or to the left and below with to the left and below. So they have to be in the same relative position. So if I just choose one at random here, let's say I choose this angle. Well, I'm to the right of the parallel line and above the transversal, so I have to go to the right of the parallel line and above the transversal, so that would be corresponding. So there are, I mean, 8 different, I'm sorry, there's 4 possibilities in each one of these diagrams. So depending on how you drew your diagram, there could have been 4 different possibilities. All right, so these are 2 different options just based on the way that I'm drawing the diagram. All right, let's go on to number 3. In number 3, it says identify the parallel lines. The parallel lines are M and N, so I'm going to say lines M and N. Let me just type that out. Lines M and N are parallel. In number 4, it says identify the transversal. The transversal intersects the other 2 lines, so line T is the transversal. Number 5, how many angles are formed by the transversal? Well, they're all numbered. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 angles are formed. So we just write 8 angles put by the transversal. Number 6, which angles are congruent? Well, we've got a bunch here. We have 4 pairs. We have angles 1 and 5 are congruent. 2 and 6 are congruent. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm telling you the corresponding angles, which are also congruent, but it's asking specifically for congruent. I was going to corresponding. So which ones are congruent? Congruence means they have the same angle measure. So we've got the corresponding angles that I was saying already, 1 and 5, 2 and 6, 4 and 8, 3 and 7. Those are all corresponding, so they are congruent by definition. But we've got other ones that are congruent to those as well. So remember, vertical angles are also congruent. So angles 1 and 3 are congruent because they're vertical. So I'm going to put angles 1 and 3 are congruent because they're vertical. But then, as I said before, 1 and 5 are congruent because they're corresponding. So I have to also put 5 in there. If 1 and 5 are the same and 1 and 3 are the same, then 3 and 5 are also the same. And then also, if 1 and 3 are the same, well, 3 and 7 are the same. They're congruent because they're also corresponding. So 3 and 7, so I need to also include a 7 in here. So all of those angles are congruent to each other. They all have the same angle measure. Whether they're vertical or corresponding, they have the same angle measure. There's another set of angles in here that are all congruent. If I look at angle 2 and angle 6, those are congruent because they are corresponding. But 2 and 4 are congruent because they're vertical. And 4 and 8 are congruent because they're corresponding. So 2, 4, 6, and 8 are also all corresponding. So 2, 4, 6, and 8. And in this diagram, you really have 2 sets of all of these congruent angles. So if you have 2 parallel lines in a transversal, the angles that look acute, like 2, 4, 6, and 8, They look congruent because they are congruent. They're either vertical or corresponding. The obtuse angles 1, 3, 5, and 7, they look congruent because they are congruent. They are the same angle measures because they're either corresponding or vertical. So you have two sets of angles that are all the same measure. Okay. All right, let's go on to number 7. Number 7, it says use the figure to find the measures of the numbered angles. So I'm just going to copy this over here real quick. There we go. And then I'm going to scroll up a little bit here. All right, so number 7, use the figure to find the measure of the numbered angles. So on this one here, we are looking at 107 and angle 1. Those are corresponding angles, so those are congruent. They have the same measure. So angle 1, this guy right here, is 107. This is 107. I'm going to put angle 1 equals 107 degrees. If this is 107 and angles 1 and 2 make a straight line, they need to add up to 180 degrees. So what do I have to add on to 107 to get 180? That is the measure of angle 2. And the answer to that question is 73 degrees. Again, they have to add up to 180 because they form a straight line. Or they form a line, I should say. All right, number 8. On number 8, 95 and angle 3 are corresponding angles. They're both above the parallel line and to the right or below the transversal. So 95 degrees and angle 3 have the same measure, so angle 3 equals 95 degrees. Because corresponding angles are congruent, meaning they have the same measure. And then angles 3 and 4 make a line, so angle 4 needs to be the number of degrees that I would add on to 95 to get 180, and that is 85 degrees. You could also do 180 minus 95, and you would get 85. On number 9, 49 degrees and angle 5 are corresponding, so they are congruent. So angle 5 is also 49 degrees. I'm going to switch up my color for this one. Angle 5 is 49 degrees. And then angle 6, angles 5 and 6 make a straight line, so because they make a line, they should add up to 180. So what do I have to add on to 49 to get 180? In other words, what is 180 minus this 49 degrees? And that is 131 degrees. There we go. All right. Let me see what, I think it was number 10 that we had to do next. Yep, we had numbers 10 and 11. So number 10, describe and correct the error. So on number 10, the error, they're saying 5 is congruent to 6 because they're thinking that these are corresponding angles, but that would only be true if we had parallel lines. So I'm going to type this out here. Since the lines are clearly not parallel, they're not marked as being parallel, and they definitely do not look parallel, so I'm going to say they are clearly not parallel. The angles are not corresponding, and therefore they are not congruent. As I was saying that, I realize I'm making a mistake here. I apologize. They're clearly not parallel. That part's okay, but the angles still are corresponding. They're not congruent because the lines are not parallel. I need to make a change here. I apologize. So since they are clearly not parallel, the corresponding angles are not congruent. So in order to have congruence, the lines would have to be parallel. All right, so let's keep moving now. Number 11. For number 11, it says the painted lines that separate parking spaces are parallel. So this one is telling us that these are parallel. And I should actually copy this one over here as well so I can draw on this and make my point with this one. So for this one, I'm going to draw a diagram over this picture here. So what I really have is this as one line as my transversal, and then I've got two parallel lines right here. And I'm going to mark that they're parallel with my little arrow symbols here. All right, so I actually do have two parallel lines and a transversal, so that is what I'm hoping that you were thinking about as you're doing this problem. And since these are parallel lines, now we can say that these corresponding angles are congruent, unlike in number 10 where they weren't parallel, so these are not congruent. So if the lines are parallel, the corresponding angles are congruent. It says the measure of angle 1 is 60 degrees. So since angle 1 is 60, and these are corresponding angles, number 2 must also be congruent. And it does say explain, so let me type this one out. So I'm going to say, since the lines are parallel, the corresponding angles are congruent. I'll put angles 1 and 2. Okay, so since the lines are parallel, the corresponding angles, angles 1 and 2, are congruent. So the measure of angle 2 is also 60 degrees. I don't have a degree symbol on this, so I'll just make my own. There we go. All right, so again, since the lines are parallel, the corresponding angles, angles 1 and 2, are congruent. So the measure of angle 2 is also 60 degrees. All right, the next question that we had to do on this one, the next set of questions, 18 through 28. So 18 through 28. All right, so on this one, number 18, it says if the measure of angle 1 right here is 124 degrees, find the measure of angle 4. So these are same side interior, same side interior. Remember same side angles, whether it's same side interior or same side exterior. If they're same side, they are supplementary. Same side supplementary, so that means they add to 180 degrees. So if they add to 180, and this is 124, 124 plus something gives me 180. In other words, just subtract 124 from 180. We'd end up with x equaling 6 to get to 30, 56 degrees. So on this one, I want angle 4. So the measure of angle 4 is 56 degrees. All right, number 19. It says if the measure of angle 2 is 48 degrees, then what's the measure of angle 3? Well, this is, again, same side interior angles. They're on the same side of the transversal. They're inside the parallel lines, so they're also supplementary, same side supplementary. So here they have to add to 180. I'm looking for the measure of angle 3 when 2 is 48, so 48 plus some other measure for angle 3 should give me 180. Subtract 48 from both sides. I get x equals 132. So the measure of angle 3 is 132 degrees. Number 20, if the measure of angle 4, this guy, is 55 degrees, then what's the measure of angle 2? Well, these are alternate interior. They are congruent. And again, if you have two parallel lines and a transversal, the acute angles, all of the acute angles, 4, 7, 2, 5, they're all the same measure. They're all congruent. So 4 and 2 have the same measure. So if 4 is 55 degrees, then angle 2 is 55 degrees. So that one's nice and easy. No work required. All right, 21. If the measure of angle 6 is 120, what's the measure of angle 8? Well, those are both obtuse angles. They are alternate exterior angles. They are congruent. So 6 and 8 have the same measure. So angle 8 is also 120 degrees. Number 22. If the measure of angle 7 is 50.5 degrees, then what's the measure of angle 6? Well, you can tell this is an acute angle that's obtuse. So on this one, they're going to be supplementary. They are same side exterior. So again, same side supplementary. They need to add to 180 degrees. So number 22, I've got 50.5 plus some other angle measure needs to give me 180 degrees. Subtract off that 50.5 from both sides. And I get x equals 180 minus 50 is 130, minus another half is 129.5. So angle 22, angle 6 is 129.5 degrees. 23, the last one in this little section. If the measure of angle 3 is 118.7 degrees, what's the measure of angle 2? These are same side interior, same side supplementary. So 23, I'm going to say 118.7 plus some other measure gives me 180. Subtract off the 118.7 from both sides of the equation. I get x equals, let's see, 1.3 to get to 120, 61.3. So the measure of angle 2 is 61.3 degrees. All right, moving on, we had to go through 28, so just a handful of questions left to go. Number 24, it says that we've got a rainbow being formed when sunlight reflects off raindrops at different angles. True story. For blue light, the measure of angle 2 is 40 degrees. What is the measure of angle 1? So if you look here, this again is, I can copy and paste this one over and draw my diagram just like I did on that parking problem. Right there. All right, so this is number 24. All right, so on 24 here, what we actually have is two parallel lines, this one and this one, and a transversal right here. So with that in mind, the two angles we're looking at, angles 1 and 2, these are actually opposite sides of the transversal, so we'd say alternate, and they're inside the parallel lines, so we'd say interior, alternate interior angles. And alternate interior angles are congruent. And again, there's two sets of congruent angles in this diagram if you have parallel lines. We've got our little arrow markings here showing us that they are parallel. So the two acute angles here, they're both acute, they're going to be congruent. If we have two parallel lines, you have two sets of congruent angles. So these two and those two are all congruent. Angles 1 and 2 are congruent. You could memorize that alternate interior angles are congruent, but that's, in my opinion, the easier way of remembering that. All right, so on 24, if angle 2 is 40 degrees, that's kind of hard to see that color. Let's go here. If angle 2 is 40 degrees, what's the measure of angle 1? Well, they're congruent, so angle 1 is also 40 degrees. So the answer, the measure of angle 1, I'll just put angle 1 equals 40 degrees. Number 25. If a transversal is perpendicular to two parallel lines, if I have a parallel line and the transversal, two parallel lines, I can't have one parallel line, and the transversal is perpendicular to these lines, which means it meets at a 90-degree angle. So this line is perpendicular to these lines means that's a 90-degree angle. It says, what can you conclude about the angles formed? Well, if this is 90, and we've got a straight line, this one's got to be 90, because 90 plus 90 has to give me 180. I need to have 180 to make a straight line, to make a line. I keep saying a straight line. Obviously, all lines are straight. You can make the same argument going this way. If this is 90 and you've got a line here, they have to add to 180, so this also has to be 90. And the same argument here, this must be 90. Well, the same thing happens down here. All of these are 90. So every single angle is 90 degrees. So I'm just going to write every angle is a right angle. That's what you can conclude. If you have two parallel lines and the transversal meets it at a 90-degree angle, then every angle formed is a right angle. All right, moving on, number 26. It says, describe two ways you can show that angle 1 is congruent to angle 7. Well, one way I can show that they are congruent is I could say that angles 1 and 7 are alternate exterior. Angles 1 and 7 are alternate exterior angles. and alternate exterior angles are congruent. So that's one way. Another way that you could show that they are congruent, you could say that angles 1 and 3 are vertical angles. Angles 1 and 3 are vertical angles, so they are congruent. And angles 3 and 7 are corresponding angles, so they are also congruent. Therefore, angles 1 and 7 must be congruent. So in this explanation, I'm saying these are congruent because they're vertical, 3 and 7 are congruent because they are corresponding, so 1 has to be also congruent to angle 7. I mean, there are other ways to do this. You could say 1 and 5 are corresponding, so they're congruent, and then 5 and 7 are vertical, so they're congruent. So that's another way. You could also say that, what's another way here? Yeah, maybe that's the only other way. I'm not seeing any others at the moment, but there are different ways to explain that, the way to show that 1 and 7 are congruent, but there are a couple of possibilities. All right, the last two questions, 27 and 28. Again, I'm going to just copy these over to my document I got going on over here. So in number 27 here, it does say find the value of x. So what we're looking at to find the value of x, which is right here, we're looking at this 50-degree angle measurement. So we've got a 50-degree angle measure right here. And if you ignore this parallel line to start, you just look at this diagram. What you can conclude is that if this is 50, then this angle right down here must also be 50 degrees. And there's different ways to prove this. I think I even did this differently in my first video that I posted with the assignment, but here's another way of doing this. So if this is 50, this one down here must also be 50, and that is because these are corresponding angles. They're both to the right of this transversal and below the parallel lines, so they're corresponding, so this one must be 50. Well, then we could ignore the other parallel line. So let me get this out of here real quick. Say this one is 50 because it's corresponding to that 50. And now if we just look at this diagram down here, this one right here, and we ignore this top parallel line, well, now this angle and this angle, we're able to find the measure indirectly. We'd say this is 50, so this one right here must be 50 because those are corresponding angles. So this one, I'll just keep using blue. This one and this one, this angle is 50, and this one must also be 50 because those are corresponding angles. This is to the right of this parallel line, to the right of the parallel line, below the transversal. And now we see that we've got a line made between x degrees and 50 degrees. Since they make a line, they must add to 180. So x plus 50 must equal 180. If you subtract 50 from both sides of the equation, you end up with x equals 130. So right there, x must be 130. We can find it in that way. And there are multiple other ways. I mean, you could say this one's 50, this one's 50. Those are same side interior angles, so they're supplementary. There's different ways of getting there, but this is another approach. All right, and the last question on this homework assignment, number 28, it's very similar to number 27. We are looking for the measure of angle, this angle right here, which is x degrees. So we know that this one over here is 115. This one's 115. So what do we have going on here? Well, if you look at this diagram, if this one's 115, and this one, let's see, this is 115, and this one right here must also be 115 because those are corresponding angles. So this one is 115 because it is corresponding to this 115. It's in the same relative position. Now if we look at this diagram and ignore this line, we have these parallel lines, and this angle and this one are corresponding. They're to the left of the parallel lines and below the transversal, so this one is also 115. So get rid of that. This is also 115 degrees. And finally, you can say these angles must be congruent because they are vertical. So x must be 115 because, again, those two angles are vertical angles and vertical angles are congruent. So there, again, there's multiple ways of getting to that conclusion. You could say this is 115 and this one's vertical, so it's 115, and that's 115, so this one's 115 because it's corresponding to this one. And if this is 115, then that's 115 because those are corresponding. So there, again, there's many ways to get there, but ultimately x should equal 115. So if you have any questions, let me know.